The storage unit smelled like old cedar and forgotten time. I stood surrounded by cardboard boxes, dusty picture frames, and furniture that had seen better decades. Grandmother Nora had passed 6 weeks before, quietly in her sleep, at 87. She had always lived without causing a fuss. I had been the one sitting beside her bed in those final weeks, holding her papery hand, reading to her from the Bible she kept on her nightstand. My cousin Brendan and his wife Vivian showed up maybe twice during those months. They brought store-bought flowers both times and left within an hour. Now, somehow, they had beaten me here. Brendan had called 3 days after the funeral, voiced smooth as oil, saying they had already visited the storage unit to help sort things out. He said the furniture was handled. He said grandmother's solid oak dining set, the one she brought from her family home in North Carolina, was already at their house because it held sentimental meaning. He said all of this like he was doing me a favor by mentioning it at all. When I arrived that Tuesday morning, I was not surprised to find it half empty. What remained were old linens, stacked books, kitchenware wrapped in newspaper, and faded photographs. I went through them slowly, telling myself objects were just objects. Then I lifted a small wooden jewelry box from beneath a faded quilt. It was heavier than expected. I turned it over and pressed a tiny notch along the bottom grain, a hidden lever. A secret compartment slid open with a soft click. Inside was a brass key. Attached to it was a small paper tag. The handwriting was shaky, but I would have known it anywhere. It was Grandmother Nora's hand. It read, "For Pauline only, Offshore Vault, Geneva. You'll know what to do." My legs nearly gave out. I stood alone in that dim unit, holding a key the size of my thumb, and the world shifted beneath my feet. My name is Pauline Hargrove. I am 61 years old, born on the outskirts of Roanoke, Virginia. Except for 4 years at a teacher's college 2 hours away, I have never lived anywhere else. I taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary for 33 years. I raised 2 children, my son Caleb and my daughter Iris, mostly alone after my husband Walter died from a heart attack when the kids were still in primary school. I drove an 11-year-old sedan, kept a vegetable garden, and took one vacation every 3 years if I could manage it. Brendan, my cousin on my father's side, had always occupied a different world. He went into commercial real estate in his 30s, made loud noise about large deals, and drove a new truck every couple of years. His wife Vivienne wore designer clothes to church and made a point of mentioning where she bought each piece. They had a lake house, a boat, and a habit of borrowing money that never came back. Grandmother Nora had paid for Brendan's first car. She helped with the down payment on his first house. She had quietly given him money on at least 4 occasions I personally knew of. Probably more I did not. I knew because she told me herself, during those long quiet evenings when I sat with her, rubbing lotion into her hands while her programs played. She would shake her head and say, "Pauline, I don't know where that boy's money goes. It just disappears." I never said anything bad about Brendan to her. I bit my tongue every single time. She simply watched. She watched me raise my children, work my job, keep my head down, and never ask for a thing. She told me once about 4 years before she died, "You are the one I don't worry about, and that is the highest compliment I know how to give." Sitting in that parking lot, pressing the key to my chest, I finally understood what she had meant. I did not tell anyone about the key for 5 full days. I went about my regular life as carefully as I could. I watered my garden. I called Caleb up in Tennessee and talked about his kids. I had dinner with my neighbor Audrey on Thursday evening and said absolutely nothing. But every morning I opened the small zipper pocket in my coat and looked at the key, just to confirm I hadn't imagined the whole thing. On the 5th day, Brendan called. He had a habit of calling at inconvenient times, early mornings, late evenings, always when I was in the middle of something. He started with small talk, asked about my health, mentioned the weather. Then his voice dropped half a register into something more deliberate. "Listen, Pauline, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about grandmother's things. We need to get the estate paperwork sorted, and I just want to check. You didn't come across anything unusual in the storage unit, did you? Any documents or paperwork we haven't accounted for?" My heart was hammering, but my voice stayed flat and even. It was mostly linens and old books, Brendan. Nothing exciting. He laughed, a little too quickly. Right. Yeah, she didn't leave much. Medical bills ate through everything. You know how that goes. A pause. Okay. Well, let me know if you need anything. We're family. I will, I said. Thank you for calling. I hung up and sat very still for nearly a full minute. Then I called my friend Weston, who had worked as a paralegal for 20 years before retiring, and asked if he could recommend a good estate attorney. He gave me a name without hesitating. Sylvia Crane, who had an office downtown and was well known for handling complicated family estate matters. I called Sylvia's office that same afternoon and made an appointment for the following Monday morning. Sylvia Crane had an office full of framed diplomas and real plants, the living kind, not plastic. She was compact and precise, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a quality of listening that made every word you said feel carefully filed away. I set the brass key on her desk and slid the tag toward her. She read it. She turned the key over slowly. She set it down. Geneva, she said. There is a cluster of private vault companies there that have operated for decades, most of them serving international private wealth. They are entirely legal, but they are built to be discreet. Your grandmother would have arranged this in person, most likely years ago. She looked up. You had no knowledge of this before finding the key? None, I said. I didn't even know she'd ever been to Switzerland. Do you have any sense of why she might have set this up? Sylvia asked. I thought about the quiet evenings, Brendan's borrowing, grandmother's slow headshake over the years. I believe she was protecting something, I said, from being spent before she could give it to who she intended. Sylvia nodded. The tag says for Pauline only. In estate law, that language can establish clear donative intent, meaning she specifically designated it for you alone. She folded her hands. But if there are significant assets in that vault, Brendan will challenge you the moment he learns about them. Does he know about the key? No, I said. I told him I found nothing. Good. Keep it that way. Don't tell anyone, not your children, not neighbors, not close friends, until we know exactly what we're dealing with. She paused. Can you travel to Geneva? I thought of my thin savings, built slowly over years of a teacher's salary and raising children alone. I can find a way, I said. Then we should move before anyone else does. Time matters in situations like this. I booked the flight on a Tuesday night at my kitchen table, laptop open, heart in my throat. I had never flown internationally before in my life. I used most of what I kept in my emergency savings, just over $2,000 collected carefully across many lean years. Sylvia had told me to bring the original key, a certified copy of grandmother's death certificate, my passport, and a signed authorization letter she prepared on my behalf. She had done preliminary research and located a vault company in Geneva called Fortier Privé that matched what the tag described. I told Caleb I was taking a short personal trip. I told my neighbor Audrey I would be gone a week and asked her to water my tomatoes. I told no one else anything at all. The flight was long and exhausting. I changed planes in London and arrived in Geneva at 6 a.m, stiff and bleary, dragging a single carry-on bag through a clean and orderly airport that smelled of coffee and floor wax. I took a train into the city, checked into a small hotel near the lake, and slept for 4 solid hours. That afternoon, I walked to the address Sylvia had found for me. Fortier Privé sat on a quiet side street, tucked between a watch repair shop and an insurance office, with a polished brass nameplate on a dark wood door. Inside, everything was hushed and thickly carpeted. A man at the reception desk asked me in French, then in English, how he could assist. I showed him the key. I showed him grandmother's death certificate. I presented my passport and Sylvia's authorization letter. He made 3 phone calls over the following hour, speaking in quiet French the entire time, while I sat in a cream-colored chair and worked steadily on breathing normally. Finally he stood, buttoned his jacket with care, and said, "Please follow me, Miss Hargrove." The room they brought me to was small and private, with a long table and soft overhead lighting. The attendant set a flat metal box on the table, used his key on one lock, then inserted mine into the second. He lifted the lid and stepped back without a word. For a long moment I simply stared. Inside were stacks of old bearer bonds held together with brittle rubber bands. Beside them sat several small cloth pouches. I lifted one gently, and it clinked with the weight of gold coins. There were 2 sealed manila envelopes with my name on each in Grandmother Nora's handwriting. Beneath those were 2 folded property deeds. Resting on top of everything was a smaller envelope that read, "Open this first." I opened it. The letter inside was dated 3 years before Grandmother's death. The handwriting was steadier than the tag. She had written this when her hands were still reliable. "My dearest Pauline, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will see I kept this secret well. I had to. Brendan has borrowed and spent, and I have forgiven him more times than I should have. I could not let what I saved for you disappear the way the rest did. This belongs to you. Every bond, every coin, every deed. I had a trusted friend help me arrange it quietly, years ago. The property deeds are for land in Caldwell County, North Carolina, my mother's land, left to me. I never sold it. I want you to have it. You cared for me without expecting anything. That is rare. Use this wisely and don't feel guilty for a single moment. All my love, Nora." I folded the letter and pressed it against my chest. The attendant stood quietly near the door, looking at nothing, giving me all the time I needed. I stayed in that small room for a long while before I was ready to move. I flew home carrying photographs of every document and item in that box, taken carefully with my phone, and both sealed manila envelopes tucked into my carry-on bag. The bearer bonds and gold coins stayed in the vault under enhanced security while Sylvia began the formal legal transfer process. The property deeds I brought home as originals. Back in Virginia, I sat across from Sylvia's desk and spread everything out for her to review. She went through each piece methodically, reading the letter, studying the deed documents, examining the photographs on my phone. When she finished, she set her glasses on the desk and looked at me directly. "Pauline, this is significant. The bearer bonds alone, based on their issuing information, could be worth a substantial sum once verified. The North Carolina land in Caldwell County, mountain land up there, has appreciated considerably over the past 2 decades. She paused. "And there's the matter of the estate itself. You said Brendan told everyone Grandmother had almost nothing left after medical bills." "That is exactly what he told people," I said. Sylvia pressed her lips together. "I'm going to pull the probate records." She pulled them within a week. What she found made my stomach drop. Brendan had filed the estate as nearly insolvent. He had listed Grandmother's small checking account, her 10-year-old car, and a few pieces of jewelry that went to Vivienne. The total declared estate value was just over $9,000. He had submitted all paperwork within 3 weeks of the funeral, pushed through with minimal court review and very little scrutiny. "He moved before anyone could ask questions," Sylvia said quietly, almost to herself. Then she looked up at me steadily. "I am filing to reopen the estate. This will trigger Brendan immediately. He will not receive this news quietly, Pauline. You need to be fully prepared for what comes next." She was entirely right about that. She was completely right. Brendan called 4 days after he was served with the petition papers. I was out in my garden when my phone rang. I saw his name and let it ring twice before answering. His voice had none of its usual smoothness. It was tight and clipped, stretched past its limit. "What is this, Pauline? What exactly do you think you are doing?" "I am asking the court to review Grandmother's estate more carefully," I said. "I believe there were assets that were not properly disclosed. That is completely insane. I handled everything by the book. Grandmother had nothing. I told you the bills. Brendan?" I kept my voice even. "Let the court sort it out." A long silence. Then controlled and low. "You need to drop this. You are going to make a fool of yourself and drag the whole family through something ugly for nothing." "Then there is nothing to find," I said pleasantly. "The review should not take long." He hung up without another word. 2 days later, he and Vivienne appeared at my door without calling first. Vivienne stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity. Brendan's jaw was set hard. I opened the door and did not step aside to invite them in. "We need to talk about this face to face," Brendan said. "That is fine," I answered. "I want to let you know I am recording this conversation." I held up my phone. Virginia is a one-party consent state. Vivian's expression flickered sharply. This is completely unbelievable, she said. You were always jealous of us, Pauline. Grandmother felt sorry for you. Everyone knew it. She helped you out of pure obligation, nothing more. I looked at her calmly. Grandmother's letter says otherwise. I will see you both in court. I closed the door quietly. My hands were shaking. But I kept the recording running for 30 more seconds. They made several comments on the porch before their footsteps finally faded. Sylvia added the recording to my file. She told me it would not be the centerpiece of anything, but it helped establish a clear pattern. The intimidation attempt, the dismissal of my claim. It paints a picture, she said, of people who have something to protect. The first hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after we filed to reopen the estate. Brendan had hired an attorney named Franklin Cole, known across our county for aggressive tactics and billing by the quarter hour. Cole filed 3 motions before the hearing even occurred. Attempting dismissal on procedural grounds, arguing the estate had been properly settled, and claiming the Geneva vault fell entirely outside Virginia probate jurisdiction. Sylvia answered each motion with precise documentation. The judge denied all 3 without hesitation. I sat in the courtroom that morning in a navy blazer I had purchased specifically for court appearances. Brendan sat at the opposing table with Cole beside him, occasionally leaning over to whisper something low, his eyes cutting toward me when he thought I was not paying attention. Vivienne sat in the gallery behind him, dressed as though she were attending a church luncheon. The judge ordered a full and complete accounting of all assets owned or controlled by grandmother Nora in the 5 years before her death. Both sides had 60 days to produce documentation in support of their positions. That evening, I could not sleep. I lay in my quiet house and stared at the ceiling and thought about every Christmas at grandmother's table, where Brendan held court, and I sat at the far end and listened politely. I thought about every time Vivienne had asked, in that particular tone of hers, "And how is teaching going, Pauline?" Stretching the word teaching like it was something small and faintly embarrassing. I thought about the letter, about the words, "You cared for me without expecting anything." By morning I felt steady again, one careful day at a time. Sylvia brought in a forensic accountant named Odette Blanc, based in Charlotte, who specialized in estate disputes and hidden asset recovery. Odette was thorough in the way quiet people often are. She spoke little, took extensive notes, and shared no preliminary opinions before she was fully certain of her conclusions. She requested everything: bank statements, wire records, property records, tax filings, every document carrying grandmother's name going back 10 years. What she uncovered over the following weeks came together like puzzle pieces placed carefully on a wide table, each one small on its own, each one fitting precisely with the next. The first piece. Grandmother had maintained a savings account at a bank separate from the one Brendan had disclosed. It had been closed 18 months before her death. The funds, just under $40,000, had moved in 3 wire transfers to an account registered in Brendan's name. The second piece. Grandmother had owned a vacant land parcel in their county for decades, adjacent to the church she had attended for most of her adult life. It had been quietly transferred out of her name 2 years before she died, using a power of attorney document held by Brendan. The land had since been sold. No proceeds appeared in any account associated with grandmother Nora. The third piece was the one that made Sylvia pause. The lake house that the whole family assumed had always belonged to Brendan and Vivienne, the one where they hosted summer gatherings, had originally belonged to grandmother. She had signed it over to Brendan through the same power of attorney document 6 years before she died. Brendan had since sold the property for $340,000. He was using that power of attorney like a personal financial tool, Odette said quietly, laying the records across Sylvia's desk. This was not careful management, this was systematic. Cole argued that the power of attorney transfers were entirely legal, that grandmother had been fully aware and consenting every single time she signed. He submitted an affidavit from the notary who had witnessed the lake house deed transfer, stating that Nora had appeared lucid and voluntary. Then a letter arrived at Sylvia's office. It came from a man named Clifford Baines. age 78, a retired banking professional who had lived next door to grandmother Nora for over 20 years. He had heard through mutual acquaintances that the estate was under legal review, and wrote that he had relevant information he wished to share with us. We met him in Sylvia's office on a Wednesday afternoon. He was tall, deliberate, and precise, the kind of man who selected each word carefully before committing to it. He told us he had known grandmother Nora since the year she moved into that house, that they had maintained a genuine friendship, and that he had personally been the one to help her locate the vault company in Geneva. She came to me because she trusted me and because I understood private financial structures, he said. She was entirely clear about her reasons. She told me her grandson had borrowed money repeatedly, and she feared that if she left things accessible, they would disappear before the right person could reach them. He folded his hands on the table. She named you specifically, Pauline. She said the vault was for you and no one else. Sylvia asked if he would be willing to testify in court. He said quietly that he had been hoping she would ask. When we disclosed Clifford's involvement during the pretrial evidence exchange, I watched Brendan's expression across the courtroom move through several visible stages. The final one settled into something that looked, for the first time in my experience of knowing him, very close to genuine fear. Vivian found me at the grocery store on a Saturday morning in October. I was in the produce section, choosing sweet potatoes, when I heard my name said in that particular tone, the one that turned my name into a slightly unfortunate fact. Pauline. I turned. She was alone, no cart, clearly not shopping. She had come looking specifically for me. Her eyes, for the first time in all the years I had known her, were red and swollen at the rims. I want you to understand something, she said, keeping her voice low. We have real financial pressures right now. Cole's fees are mounting. We have our own children to think about. Brendan made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Reasonable to whom? I asked gently. She blinked, not expecting the question. To both of us. Grandmother's memory wasn't always reliable, and Brendan was trying to manage things before they became too complicated for everyone. I thought about grandmother's letter, her clear and steady handwriting. I thought about Clifford Baines describing her as articulate and purposeful across 3 separate conversations about the vault arrangements. A woman who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why. Vivian, I said, 2 years ago I had a surgical procedure. I needed some help with the bill. I called Brendan. He told me he was stretched too thin at the moment to help. I paused and kept my voice kind. He had just listed the lake house for sale at that same time. She looked at the floor between us. Her jaw worked slightly before she composed herself. I don't wish either of you harm, I said, because it was genuinely true. But I am asking the court to give grandmother's intentions the respect they deserve. That is all I am doing. I placed a sweet potato in my bag and pushed my cart slowly down the aisle. I did not look back. There was nothing there I needed to see. Odette's final forensic report was submitted to the court in late November. It was 43 pages long. Sylvia walked me through the summary in her office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the heater ticking steadily in the corner. The report established that assets totaling approximately $480,000 had been removed from grandmother Nora's estate over a 6-year period, through power of attorney transfers, the quietly closed savings account, the church land sale, and the lake house proceeds. When combined with the Geneva vault contents, the bearer bonds verified at roughly $210,000, the gold coins at nearly $40,000 more, and the North Carolina mountain land appraised at $120,000, the full picture was extraordinary. Brendan had declared a $9,000 estate. The actual estate, properly and completely accounted for, was many times that figure. Sylvia explained the legal implications carefully and without rushing. He will argue these were gifts freely given, that grandmother transferred everything willingly with full knowledge. That is where the power of attorney documentation and the timing become absolutely critical. Using a power of attorney to transfer significant assets to yourself while the grantor is elderly is heavily scrutinized by courts, and it should be. And the lake house proceeds, spent without any estate accounting whatsoever, are legally recoverable. She paused and gave me a moment to absorb everything fully. What about the Geneva vault itself? I asked. The letter, the tag, and Clifford Baines's sworn testimony. Together they establish clear and specific donative intent. The vault contents belong to you, Pauline. That part I feel genuinely and completely confident about. She folded her hands on the desk. Trial is set for January. We are ready. Outside Sylvia's window, the trees along the street were completely bare. I drove home in the early dark, already thinking about January. December became its own quiet war. Cole filed a motion arguing that grandmother had not been mentally competent when she wrote my letter or when she arranged the Geneva vault, that her memory had been declining, and her decisions during that period could not be legally relied upon. It was a calculated move. Establish diminished capacity, and he could argue that none of her expressed wishes held any legal weight at all. Sylvia responded with grandmother's complete medical records from that same period. Her physician, Dr. Annabelle Forte, had been grandmother's doctor for 12 years and documented her mental status at regular intervals throughout. The notes were clear and consistent. Mild age-related memory changes appropriate for her age, but no diagnosis of dementia, no documented confusion, and nothing that would have impaired her legal decision-making capacity in any medically recognized way. Clifford Baines filed a written declaration stating that across 3 separate meetings about the vault arrangements, grandmother Nora had been articulate, specific, and entirely purposeful in everything she communicated. She knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why she was doing it, he wrote plainly. I would not have assisted her otherwise. Not for any reason. Cole requested the court appoint an independent medical expert to review grandmother's history. The judge agreed, which gave me a moment of genuine anxiety while I waited, but the independent expert's conclusions came back fully consistent with Dr. Forte's documented records from across 12 years of care. The competency motion was formally denied. I watched Brendan in the courthouse hallway after the ruling, standing with Cole, listening to something said in a low and careful tone. Brendan's shoulders were rigid. He looked older to me than the last time I had genuinely studied his face. I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those. I turned and walked toward the exit. 3 weeks before trial, something happened that neither Sylvia nor I had anticipated. Cole filed a new exhibit, a handwritten note, 1 page, dated 18 months before grandmother's death. The note read, in handwriting that resembled grandmother Nora's, that she wished to revoke any prior arrangements for separate, private gifts to individual family members, and that all her wishes were to be handled solely through the will Brendan had already probated. Cole presented it as evidence that grandmother had changed her mind entirely about the vault and about me. Sylvia read it twice. She called me that same afternoon. Something is wrong with this document, she said carefully. I can see it even from the photocopy. We need the original analyzed by a qualified expert immediately. The court ordered the original produced and submitted for professional examination. Sylvia hired a forensic document examiner named Harriet Voss, who had provided sworn testimony in formal court proceedings across 5 states over many years. Harriet spent 1 full week examining the note alongside verified samples of grandmother's known handwriting, letters grandmother had written to me personally and to her church community over the years. Harriet's written report was brief and entirely direct. The note had not been produced by the same hand as any of the verified samples. Ink composition analysis further indicated the document had been created within the past 2 years, not 18 months before grandmother's death, as the date on the note claimed. Harriet was fully prepared to testify to both of these conclusions, under oath, in open court. Sylvia filed a motion formally citing the forgery. The judge reviewed the complete evidence and found it entirely credible and compelling. He sanctioned Cole's firm formally in writing and issued a finding that the document was fraudulent. I sat in that courtroom while the ruling was read aloud. I kept my face completely still. Brendan, across the room, stared at the table before him and did not look up once. Trial began on a cold morning in January. I wore the same navy blazer purchased specifically for court appearances. Sylvia had told me to dress like someone who grades reading papers and coaches spelling groups, not like someone who had recently discovered a European vault. And I thought that was the most accurate advice anyone had offered me in a very long time. The courtroom was not dramatic in the way people imagine courtrooms to be. There were no packed galleries, no audible gasps. It was methodical and precise, the way real legal proceedings almost always are. Nothing like the version shown on television. The judge was efficient and visibly unimpressed by theatrical gestures from either side, which worked entirely in our favor. I took the stand on the second morning of trial. Sylvia walked me through the full timeline steadily. How I found the key, what the tag said, how I contacted her, what I discovered in Geneva. Then she asked me to describe my relationship with grandmother Nora. In my own words, I told the truth. I told it plainly, without decoration or unnecessary drama. I talked about evenings sitting with grandmother while her programs played with the volume turned too loud. I talked about bringing her soup from the diner on Main Street because she said theirs was better than anything she could make herself anymore. I talked about the final weeks, the way her hand felt in mine, the specific Bible passages she liked to hear read aloud. I talked about how asking her for money had simply never occurred to me. Not as a conscious strategy, but because it genuinely never entered my mind. The courtroom stayed quiet while I spoke. Cole's cross-examination was brief and found very little purchase. He suggested I had positioned myself near grandmother specifically to influence her estate. I answered every question calmly and with plain facts. He had little to work with, because the truth was entirely simple. I had just been present. Brendan took the stand on the third day of trial. He was well-dressed and composed, speaking in the careful voice of someone who had been coached at length. He testified that he had managed grandmother's affairs in her final years because she had asked him to, and because he had the financial experience to handle it properly. He said the lake house transfer was a planned arrangement they had discussed together. He said the funds from the closed bank account had covered expenses he fronted for her care. Sylvia cross-examined him using Odette's documents. She asked about the wire transfer, just under $40,000, moved from grandmother's account to his, 8 months before grandmother's health began to visibly decline. She asked for receipts showing which care expenses that transfer had covered. He did not have them. She asked about the land parcel adjacent to the church. She asked whether grandmother had attended that church for over 40 years. He said yes. She asked for written documentation of grandmother's wish to transfer that land to him. He said it was an oral agreement. She asked for any witnesses. He did not have any. She turned to the lake house. He maintained the sale proceeds had covered grandmother's care facility costs. Sylvia placed the complete billing records in front of him. There was a documented gap of over $200,000 that nothing could account for. He said he had reinvested a portion to generate income on her behalf. She asked where that income was documented. He looked toward Cole. Cole was studying the table in front of him very carefully. When Vivian took the stand that afternoon, she contradicted Brendan on 3 separate dates and 2 conversations he had cited in his own testimony. The judge made a written note each time it happened. By the end of that day, the courtroom had grown very quiet. The kind of quiet that only settles when a truth has become impossible to look away from. Closing arguments came on the 5th day. Cole argued that Brendan had operated in complete good faith, that all transfers were legitimate exercises of a legal power of attorney, and that the Geneva vault, however emotionally compelling, existed outside proper estate planning and could not override the legally probated will. Sylvia was unhurried and methodical. She laid out the timeline piece by piece, the power of attorney used across a 6-year window, the pattern of assets moving steadily from grandmother's name to Brendan's control, the lake house proceeds entirely unaccounted for, the forensic examiner's findings on the forged note, and the consistent documented record of grandmother Nora's intent regarding the vault. She finished simply. Pauline Hargrove did not come looking for a fight. She went to sort through her grandmother's belongings and found a key with her name on it. Everything that followed has been her effort to honor what her grandmother clearly and specifically wanted, The evidence supports that at every point. The judge thanked both sides and reserved his ruling for 2 weeks. I drove home through familiar streets in the early dark and sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The house was quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the television, without picking up my phone, without doing anything except sitting in the particular silence that follows something that has been long and hard and is now nearly done. Whatever the ruling turned out to be, I had handled myself the way I intended to. I had not shouted, I had not threatened anyone, or let my anger shape me into someone I would regret. I had told the truth and allowed it to carry its own weight. Some things are enough when you simply let them be enough. I believed that then, and I still believe it now. During the 2 weeks of waiting, something unexpected happened that no one had anticipated or planned for. The IRS sent formal letters to both Brendan and the estate attorney who had handled the original probate filing. Sylvia explained the situation to me carefully. When a probate case is formally reopened and a court accounting filed citing significant undisclosed assets, that information enters public court record, and the IRS monitors such filings as a routine administrative matter. The gap between the $9,000 declared estate and the assets now carefully documented in open court proceedings had triggered an automatic review process. I had not reported Brendan to the IRS. I had not contacted any government agency beyond the court system itself. I had done nothing except tell the truth in a courtroom, and the legal process had set everything else in motion entirely on its own. Cole sent Sylvia a terse written message indicating that Brendan was facing additional serious pressures and requesting a conversation about possible settlement terms. Sylvia brought the message to me without any recommendation attached, laying it out as straightforward information for me to consider on my own terms. "Do you want to settle?" she asked. I sat with that question genuinely and for some real time. I was tired in a way that had settled deep into my bones. The legal process had been long and financially draining, and although Sylvia had deferred some of her fees pending outcome, real costs had eaten steadily into my already thin savings. A settlement would mean something certain arriving now, rather than waiting further. But I thought about the forged note. I thought about Vivian in the grocery store saying Brendan had made decisions that seemed reasonable. I thought about the lake house and the church land and $40,000 moved in 3 quiet wire transfers. "No," I said. "Let the judge rule." Sylvia nodded once, the way she did when she agreed with something but would not say it aloud. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday morning. Sylvia called me at 9:15, and I knew from the very first half-second of her voice that it had gone our way. I drove to her office and read the full ruling document myself, sitting across from her desk, going through it page by page without rushing. The court found that the Geneva vault contents were the sole property of Pauline Hargrove, established by clear and consistent evidence of donative intent, including grandmother's letter, the tag on the key, Clifford Baines's sworn testimony, and the vault company's official records. The ruling was explicit and left no room for further challenge on any point. The court found that Brendan Hargrove had misused his power of attorney to transfer assets, including the lake house, the adjacent land parcel, and the savings account funds, without proper authorization or documentation consistent with genuine fiduciary conduct. He was ordered to fully account for all lake house proceeds and pay restitution to the estate. The court found that the probated will had been filed with material omissions and ordered the estate reopened for complete and proper distribution. My share, calculated as a named beneficiary under the corrected estate accounting, came with accrued interest. Attorney's fees were awarded against Brendan, citing the sanctioned forged document. The total, across all components combined, was more money than I had earned across 15 full years of teaching elementary school children to read and write and believe in themselves, and to never stop asking questions. I sat with that number for a long moment. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was quieter than any word I know, something like the physical sensation of a breath held far too long finally being released, gently and completely. Not celebration, not vindication, just the simple, clean feeling of being able to breathe again. Just that, and it was more than enough. Enforcement took several months to complete. These processes never happen overnight, and Sylvia had prepared me for that reality from the very beginning. Court judgments are only as effective as the practical ability to collect on them, and collection required additional filings, formal asset disclosures, and a steady patience I had to actively choose each morning. Brendan did not have sufficient liquid cash to satisfy the restitution order. He had spent the lake house proceeds across several years, on a boat, on renovations to their home, on various expenses he could not fully document to the court's satisfaction. A complete financial disclosure of all assets held jointly by Brendan and Vivian was formally ordered. Vivian's car, a late-model luxury vehicle registered as a joint marital asset, was identified and seized as part of the collection process. I felt no particular satisfaction about that specific consequence, though Sylvia reminded me I had not requested it. The court had determined what enforcement required. Their house was the harder matter. It was too large, purchased in part with funds the court had now determined were misappropriated over years. They were required to sell it and move to something considerably smaller. I learned of the house sale through a distant mutual cousin, not through any direct contact between us. They relocated to a modest rental on the far side of our county. I did not speak to Brendan or Vivian throughout this period. All communication was mediated entirely through attorneys, and I trusted Sylvia completely with every step. By late summer, enforcement was largely resolved. Funds were transferred through proper legal channels, the vault contents moved formally into my name, and the North Carolina mountain land placed entirely in my name through proper deed transfer. That evening I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, grandmother's letter on the table before me, and stayed quietly with the moment. Brendan came to my door on a Sunday evening in early September. I was reading in the living room when the knock came. I looked out the front window first. His truck, the new one replaced now by an older model, was parked at the curb. He was alone. I could see that he had lost weight. The confident set of his jaw that I had known my entire life was gone, replaced by something softer and uncertain. I opened the door. "Pauline." His voice was quieter and rougher than I had ever heard it. "Can I come in?" I considered it honestly. Then I stepped back and let him enter. I did not offer anything. We stood in my living room. He glanced at the framed letter on my side table, grandmother's words visible behind the glass, and looked away from it quickly. "I am not going to pretend I handled things right," he said. "I want you to know that I didn't." He swallowed. "We are in a difficult place right now. I am not here to ask for money. I just want to know if there's any chance you could think of us as family again, someday." I studied my cousin. I had known him since we were children, building forts in grandmother's backyard. I had watched him become someone I no longer recognized. And I had watched myself, through every hard step of the past 2 years, remain someone I did recognize, someone I had no reason to be ashamed of. "Brendan," I said carefully, "I fought for what grandmother wanted, and I did it the right way. What you chose to do with what she trusted you to manage, those were your decisions. They belong to you to carry." I paused. "I don't wish you harm, but forgiveness is not a settlement agreement. It cannot be signed and filed." I opened the door gently. He left quietly, and I closed it softly behind him. By the end of that year, I had paid off the small remaining mortgage on my house entirely. I established college savings accounts for Caleb's 3 children, and Iris's 2. Enough to give each grandchild a real foundation that I had never had the financial means to offer before. I made a donation to Millbrook Elementary, directed toward the reading program, where I had spent 33 years watching children discover that words could carry them anywhere worth going. And I established the Nora Hargrove Scholarship Fund. By some standards, it was modest. Enough to provide 1 full annual scholarship to a graduating senior from our county pursuing a degree in education. I worked with the local school board on the selection criteria, demonstrated financial need, a genuine love of learning, and a character reference from a teacher who knew the applicant well enough to speak honestly about who they were. The first recipient was a young woman named Adeline who wanted to teach high school history. She was the daughter of a single mother who had worked 2 jobs for many years without complaint or recognition. At the small ceremony where the scholarship was announced, I stood quietly at the back of the room and watched Adeline hold the letter and press her lips together so she would not cry in front of the people gathered there. I thought about Grandmother Nora, watching from somewhere beyond the reach of courts and filings and legal proceedings. I thought about the letter she had written 3 years before she died, about her steady handwriting and the words she chose so carefully. I let that image settle fully inside me, without rushing past it the way I normally rush past things that matter. I did not seek press coverage of the scholarship. There was a brief mention in the local paper, 2 short paragraphs, nothing more. It did not need to be more than that. It already was exactly what she had wanted it to be. In the months that followed the ruling, people found me in quiet ways. Our town was too small and too rooted for loud public announcements. It happened slowly. A woman stopped me after Sunday service to squeeze my hand and say, "We all watched how you cared for Miss Nora at the end. We're glad it came out right for you." An old neighbor of grandmother's left a jar of apple butter on my porch with a card that read, "Justice is slow, but it is not blind." A former teaching colleague told me over lunch that her own family had gone through something similar a decade earlier, and that she had never found the courage to fight it the way I had. I listened to every one of them. I did not position myself as someone with answers to hand out. I simply listened, the way grandmother had taught me by example over 60 years of living. What I had figured out was narrower and more personal than general advice. The right way is almost always the harder way, and the harder way is almost always worth it. I had not screamed at Brendan in a driveway or sent accusatory messages. I had not campaigned for allies at the church coffee hour or let anger make me someone unrecognizable. I had found an attorney, gathered documentation, trusted the legal process, and told the plain truth on a witness stand without decoration. Grandmother Nora had watched me for 61 years and known exactly what I was made of. The key was not simply a gift, it was recognition. It was her saying, across whatever distance separates the living from the gone, "I see you clearly. I see the way you live your life. This is for you." That knowledge, I found, was worth more than any figure on any bank statement. It is the kind of thing that cannot be probated, transferred, or taken away by anyone. I am 64 years old now. I sit in my living room on a quiet evening in early spring, the window cracked just enough to let in the smell of the garden coming back to life. Grandmother Nora's letter is framed on the wall above my desk. The brass key hangs beside it on a plain small nail. Ordinary looking, the kind you would walk right past in any hardware store without a second thought. I think about the woman who hid it, who traveled to Geneva at some point in her 70s and sat across from vault attendants and gave her instructions with a quiet precision that no one in her family would have ever attributed to a woman who served sweet tea in her kitchen and kept her deepest feelings to herself. Who loved her family imperfectly, as every family is loved, who was taken advantage of by some of them, and who made one final and careful arrangement to make sure the right thing would happen in the end. I think about what it requires to be that kind of person. Patient, purposeful. Keeping your counsel until exactly the moment it matters. Trusting that careful preparation outlasts emotional reaction every single time. She understood something true about how the world works. I learned from her example, both in how she chose to live and in how I chose to handle everything she left behind for me. I fought through proper legal channels with documentation and professionals I trusted. I told the truth and let it carry its own weight. If you have ever been the person in your family who shows up without being asked, who does the quiet work without recognition, who gets overlooked in favor of louder voices, know this: the people who matter most are watching more carefully than you realize. They see everything. Stay steady, tell the truth, fight the right way, and always check the hidden compartments. The most important things are sometimes waiting in precisely the place you were always meant to find them. If this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have ever found something unexpected hidden in your own family, A truth, a letter, a quiet gift meant only for you. I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. Real stories carry more weight than we often give them credit for.